A shadow lingers over Ashbourne Manor, where every whispered secret and hollow-eyed portrait hides a family's dark, unbroken curse. Elizabeth Blackwell must confront a centuries-old pact or watch her bloodline crumble under the weight of its own sins. The Blackwell carriage rolled slowly down the winding road, its wheels rattling over stones smoothed by centuries of Virginia rain. The horses snorted and stamped, uneasy under the weight of the family they carried. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished leather and candle wax, mingling with the faint tang of the harbor salt that had clung to the seafaring streets of the port town. Elizabeth Blackwell pressed her small hands to the glass of the carriage window, her green eyes wide as the estate came into view. "Sorry to interrupt, but I gotta ask, where are you tuning in from? Drop it in the comments." Ashbourne Manor loomed ahead, its silhouette stretching like a dark sentinel against the evening sky. Towers and gables entwined in creeping ivy, windows catching the dying light and reflecting it back like eyes that watched. Rumors had already reached the ears of the townsfolk. They whispered that the Blackwells were no ordinary family of wealth, no ordinary line of merchants or landowners. Some said their fortune had been won through cunning. Others whispered of darker things, shadows that seemed to follow their ancestors like vultures circling a long-forgotten carcass. Elizabeth had overheard fragments of these stories from servants and dockhands alike. Tales of strange contracts, disappearances in the night, and of a family that spoke in strange codes to one another, as if their words were shields against prying eyes. Her father, Silas Blackwell, sat rigidly at the front of the carriage, posture stiff, expression unreadable. He rarely smiled, and when he did, it was more a baring of teeth than warmth. Her mother, Margaret, dressed in layers of silk and lace, fanned herself nervously, murmuring instructions to the driver about the care of their belongings, the condition of the stables, the necessity of first impressions. Elizabeth had always known her parents to be exacting, demanding, and distant. But there was something different about this journey. Something in the way the trees leaned toward the road as though eager to witness their arrival, or perhaps to warn them away. Elizabeth's attention returned to the manor itself. The gates were tall, wrought iron, curling in intricate patterns that looked almost alive in the fading sunlight. Beyond, the drive stretched into a courtyard cobbled with irregular stones, worn smooth over decades of footfalls. Statues of angels and men in frozen poses flanked the path, their eyes chipped and hollowed, staring down at the carriage as if judging the newcomers. She felt a shiver ripple through her, a sensation that she was crossing a threshold into something far larger, far older than the mere estate itself. The carriage halted at the grand entrance. Servants pale, stiff-backed, faces drawn with anxiety emerged to assist with luggage. The heavy wooden doors of Ashbourne Manor opened with a groan, revealing the cavernous interior, where shadows seemed to stretch and curl along the walls, dancing faintly in the light of flickering candelabras. Elizabeth stepped out, her small feet crunching against the cobblestones, and as she looked up at the towering facade, she thought she saw it breathe. The windows pulsed with a faint warmth. The ivy twisted in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate, as if the manor itself were alive, aware of her presence. She caught the glance of her father, stern and alert, and her mother, frowning with delicate concern, but Elizabeth's gaze lingered on the estate. Ashbourne Manor was not merely a home, it was a being with a history, a weight, a pulse. And in that moment, she felt it watching her, welcoming her, and perhaps already judging her. Elizabeth stepped closer to the entrance, unaware that the manor had marked her arrival, that the long lineage of the Blackwell bloodline had begun another chapter, and that some of the whispers from the town carried truths she would come to know far too well. The air was thick, almost tangible, as if the estate exhaled slowly in anticipation. Elizabeth shivered, and though she did not know why, she felt alive, truly alive, in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. The Blackwell family had arrived at Ashbourne Manor, and the estate in turn had noticed them. Elizabeth lingered in the shadows of her father's private study, a room she had been strictly forbidden to enter. The heavy door, carved from dark mahogany, loomed before her like the entrance to another world, and the brass handle gleamed faintly under the dim light of the hallway. She had watched her father move within this room countless times, always with a sense of reverence, always carrying himself as though the air itself feared to intrude. But tonight, driven by curiosity she could no longer suppress, she turned the handle with trembling hands and slipped inside. The study was larger than any room she had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined the walls, crammed with leather-bound tomes whose spines bore titles in fading gold lettering, some so ancient the words had begun to peel away entirely. The air smelled of wax polish, old paper, and a faint hint of something darker, an undertone she couldn't name but felt in the pit of her stomach. A fire flickered in the hearth, casting shadows that danced like restless spirits across the walls, elongating and twisting around the edges of the furniture. Elizabeth's eyes fell upon a desk, massive and ornate, carved with swirling motifs that seemed to writhe under the firelight. Papers and ledgers were stacked neatly, but one corner of the desk held a small, unlocked drawer. She knelt and opened it, discovering an assortment of letters, brittle with age, tied together with a ribbon blackened by time. Her fingers trembled as she untied the bundle, and as she unfolded the first letter, her pulse quickened. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, yet strange, with flourishes that made some of the words almost indecipherable. The letters spoke of a pact made long ago, during the earliest days of the Blackwell settlement in Virginia, with a figure whose name was never fully written, only hinted at, a shadowed entity referred to as the benefactor. The words described a covenant, a promise of wealth, land, and influence in exchange for loyalty and obedience, a loyalty that would extend across generations. Elizabeth's breath caught as she read passages describing conditions that were unsettling in their specificity, rules that seemed designed to bind not just her ancestors, but every descendant yet to come. The letters hinted at ceremonies performed in secret, in the dead of night, at the heart of the dense forests surrounding the estate. There were references to symbols etched in the earth, to bloodlines marked and watched, to whispers of consequences for those who might defy the pact. Elizabeth traced the words with her finger, feeling a chill seep into her bones. The documents suggested that the family's fortune, the very wealth that allowed Ashbourne Manor to rise from the wilderness, was not simply inherited or earned, but purchased with a currency darker than silver or gold. She felt a wave of both fear and fascination. Her family, the Blackwells, had prospered beyond measure, yet it was clear now that the price had never been fully revealed to the living. Elizabeth's mind raced with the implications. If the letters were true, if the pact was still binding, then the shadows in the halls of Ashbourne Manor were not merely echoes of the past. They were active, waiting, watching, ensuring that the family remained faithful. Her heart pounded as she realized she had stumbled upon something forbidden, something that her parents would never allow her to see. She glanced around the study, as if the walls themselves might overhear her thoughts. The fire crackled, throwing a final flicker of light across the pages, and Elizabeth understood, with an icy certainty, that the Blackwell Legacy was built on secrets, on bargains struck in the dark, and that she, like all Blackwells before her, was already entangled in a story far larger, far older, and far more dangerous than she had ever imagined. She closed the letters carefully, her hands still trembling, and tucked them beneath her coat. Outside, the night pressed close against the manor, silent, watchful. Elizabeth left the study, the door clicking shut behind her, and she felt the weight of the pact settle over her like a shroud. The Blackwell Dynasty was bound to its shadows, and now Elizabeth had seen them. The manor had fallen into a brittle silence, the kind that made even the tiniest creak of a floorboard sound like a shout. Elizabeth lay awake in her chamber, the candlelight from the sconces flickering against the pale wallpaper, throwing long, quivering shadows across the room. The night was heavy, almost alive, pressing against the windows, and she felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. It was in that oppressive quiet that she first heard it. A whisper, soft and uneven, brushing against her ear as if carried by the draft. She froze, straining to hear more. The voice seemed to come from just beyond the doorway, from the darkened hallway where the candlelight didn't reach. Heart hammering, Elizabeth slipped from beneath the covers, careful to make no sound. Her bare feet barely whispered against the cold wooden floor as she crept to the door. She paused, listening. The whisper had vanished, replaced by the faintest shuffle of movement, too deliberate to be the wind, too light to be her father or mother. A flicker of shadow passed along the far wall, shifting, stretching, and then disappearing into the darkness of the long corridor. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat. She had never believed in spirits, not in the stories the port town children told each other. But there was a pulse in the manor that was not natural. Something old. Something waiting. The hallway was lined with portraits of Blackwell ancestors. Their eyes painted with such intensity, it felt as though they followed her as she moved. She kept her gaze low, aware that every step carried her further from the safety of her room and closer to a wing of the manor she had been warned never to enter. Servants scuttled through the corridors like shadows themselves, always polite, but their eyes betrayed a terror Elizabeth had never seen elsewhere. Whispers of what the Blackwells owe and never speak of the hidden wing followed her in fragments of hushed conversation she caught when no one thought she was listening. Drawn by a mix of fear and fascination, Elizabeth moved toward the source of the flickering shadows. Her hand grazed the wall, fingers tracing the worn banister as she followed the hallway into a section of the manor she had never been allowed to explore. The air here was colder, heavier, carrying the scent of old stone and the faint tang of iron. She pressed herself against the wall, peering around the corner, and glimpsed movement, a figure, or perhaps several, shifting just out of clear view. They were impossibly quick, almost liquid in the way they glided between doorways, leaving nothing but an echo of presence behind. Elizabeth swallowed her fear and whispered, "Who's there?" No answer came, only the hushed echo of her own voice and the faint shuffle of footsteps retreating into the shadows. She realized the manor itself seemed to pulse in response, the floor beneath her feet vibrating subtly, as if the walls were aware she had crossed some invisible line. The servants had not lied. There was a part of Ashbourne Manor that did not welcome inquiry, a hidden wing whose secrets were stitched into the very foundation of the house. A sudden draft extinguished the candle at the end of the hallway, plunging her into darkness. Elizabeth froze, shivering as the whisper returned, this time closer, almost tangible, brushing against her ear like the soft brush of silk. "You shouldn't be here." The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but it carried the weight of centuries. Elizabeth's heart raced, yet a stubborn determination rooted her to the spot. She would not retreat, not yet. And then, in the blackness, she saw it. A fleeting silhouette, a figure too tall and thin to be human, slipping through the walls as if they were mist. Elizabeth's breath caught. The hidden wing was alive, its shadows aware, and she had stepped across the threshold. The Blackwell Legacy, the Pact, the whispered debts, they were not confined to letters or history. They were here, moving in the hallways, waiting, watching, ensuring that every Blackwell, and anyone who dared their curiosity, understood the price of inheritance. Elizabeth backed away slowly, her pulse pounding, yet her mind raced with a terrible fascination. The shadows would not leave her alone, nor would the secrets she had glimpsed. Ashbourne Manor was a living entity, breathing in the dark, and she knew, with a certainty that made her shiver, that the night had only just begun. The dawn broke over Ashbourne Manor with an uneasy stillness. The sun's rays filtered through a thin mist that clung to the rolling hills like a shroud. Elizabeth wandered through the manicured gardens, the morning chill biting at her skin, her thoughts still tangled in the shadows she had glimpsed the night before. The manor seemed to hum beneath her feet, a quiet, insistent pulse that reminded her of the whispered warning in the hallways. Some things were watching, some things waited. She paused near the edge of the estate, where the neatly trimmed lawns gave way to wild, overgrown woodlands. That was when she saw it, a figure, standing at the far edge of the grounds, motionless and cloaked in black. The figure's presence was unmistakable, yet impossible to define. It did not move like a man or a woman, and there was a rigid precision to the way it held itself that suggested purpose, not curiosity. Elizabeth froze, her stomach tightening. She knew instinctively that this was no ordinary watcher. The figure's hood obscured its face completely, leaving only the suggestion of darkness beneath it. Even from this distance, she could feel its gaze, cold and unyielding, sweeping across the manor as though cataloging every movement. It was an intruder and a guardian all at once, a silent sentinel ensuring that the Blackwell family remained tethered to a contract they could not escape. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. Every fiber of her being screamed to run, to hide, but curiosity anchored her to the spot. She could not tear her eyes away. It was not long before the servants began to murmur of sightings, their voices trembling whenever the cloaked figure appeared. "The Watcher," some whispered, though none dared speak its name aloud. "It keeps the estate in order," another would say. Voice barely more than a breath. Elizabeth learned that it appeared at unpredictable hours, sometimes at dawn, sometimes when the moon was high and silvered, always watching, never intervening unless the Blackwells strayed too far from what had been promised generations ago. Elizabeth's father, Lord Blackwell, never spoke of the figure directly, though his eyes darkened when it was mentioned. Once, he muttered in frustration that some debts could not be ignored, that promises carved in blood and shadow demanded acknowledgement beyond mortal understanding. His voice was sharp, strained, and filled with the weight of centuries. Elizabeth realized then that the wealth and the grandeur of Ashbourne Manor came at a cost far greater than she had imagined, a price enforced by this silent, black-cloaked enforcer. In the afternoons, Elizabeth found herself drawn to the edge of the gardens, seeking the figure, hoping to understand it. It never approached, never acknowledged her presence, yet its gaze seemed to follow, teaching her a lesson she did not yet understand. Compliance was mandatory, defiance perilous. On one particular day, she noticed footprints in the damp earth near where the figure had stood, though no one could have walked there, no human being had been present. They were deep, precise, and impossibly long, as if the very ground itself had been pressed into shape by something otherworldly. By nightfall, Elizabeth's mind raced with questions she could not voice. Who was this entity? Why had it come to the Blackwell estate, and how long had it been guarding their legacy? Was it a punishment, a protector, or both? The manor seemed to thrum with unspoken answers, but they eluded her. All she could sense was a presence that demanded attention, a vigilance so relentless that no Blackwell could ignore it. As the fog thickened around Ashbourne Manor that night, Elizabeth knew one truth with chilling clarity. The cloaked figure was not merely an observer. It was the embodiment of the Pact, the shadow of the deal struck by her ancestors, a living reminder that the Blackwells' wealth and influence were never freely given. Every step she took, every secret she uncovered, was being measured, weighed, and recorded by a presence that would not rest until the family had fulfilled its inescapable destiny. The Watcher would be there, always, and it was patient enough to wait centuries for compliance. Elizabeth retreated to the manor, the night pressing against her as if aware of her unease. She could feel the figure lingering just beyond the trees, its black cloak melting into the shadows, unmoving yet omnipresent. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by visions of its empty hood and the knowledge that Ashbourne Manor's true guardian was not human, not kind, and not merciful. The Pact lived in the figure, and the figure lived to enforce it. The morning air in Ashbourne Manor was thick with unease, carrying the scent of damp earth and old wood, as if the estate itself sensed the turmoil that was about to unfold. Elizabeth's younger brother, Thomas, had awoken pale and shivering, his small body trembling under the heavy quilt in his chamber. At first, the family believed it was a passing fever, perhaps the result of the chill that still lingered over the Virginia hills. But as the hours stretched, it became evident that this was no ordinary illness. His skin grew cold to the touch, his pulse erratic, and his eyes, once bright with youthful curiosity, dulled into a glassy despair. Elizabeth watched her parents with mounting anxiety, noting the strained lines etched into their faces. Her mother, Lady Blackwell, hovered over Thomas with a handkerchief pressed to his forehead, whispering prayers that seemed swallowed by the vast, shadowed halls of Ashbourne. Her father, Stoic and grim, consulted with the manor's physician, a man who avoided eye contact and muttered uneasily whenever Thomas's symptoms worsened. Elizabeth could sense the unspoken fear that clung to the household like a persistent shadow. Whatever had befallen Thomas was tied to forces beyond the reach of medicine or reason. It was during this restless morning that Mr. Hawthorne, a long-time family friend and historian of the Blackwell lineage, arrived at the manor. His presence, usually a comfort, now carried an ominous weight. After inquiring about Thomas's condition, he pulled Elizabeth aside into the vast library, its walls lined with centuries of tomes and records, the air heavy with the scent of parchment and dust. His eyes, usually sharp and lively, were clouded with worry. "Elizabeth," he began, his voice low and urgent, "there are matters of the Blackwell bloodline you must understand. You have felt the weight of your family's history, the whispers in the halls, the shadows that lingered in corners. These are not mere figments of imagination." He paused, letting the gravity of his words settle. "Your brother's illness is the first true sign of the bloodline's curse. The pact your ancestors struck long before the manor was even built requires strict adherence. Neglect, disobedience, or ignorance can bring misfortune upon the heirs. It is the pact itself that reaches into this world, punishing the living when its conditions are unmet." Elizabeth's stomach knotted. She had suspected the family's wealth and influence were tied to something dark, but hearing it spoken aloud crystallized a horror she had tried to keep at bay. "But what could Thomas have done? We've done nothing to break anything." Her voice trembled as she spoke, the enormity of her ignorance weighing down every word. Mr. Hawthorne shook his head gravely. "It is not always the acts themselves, Elizabeth, but the inattention, the failure to honor what is owed. The pact does not rest quietly. It demands attention, vigilance, and reverence. Bloodlines carry its memory, its obligations, and sometimes its wrath manifests in the most vulnerable." As he spoke, Elizabeth could hear the faint, almost imperceptible whispering through the hallways, the same voices she had sensed in the shadows, rising like a tide just beyond the threshold of hearing. She realized, with chilling clarity, that the manor itself was alive to her brother's suffering, as if the estate bore witness to every act of compliance or neglect. The remainder of the day passed in a tense blur. Thomas's condition fluctuated, and Elizabeth spent hours at his bedside, her mind racing with questions that had no answers. She could feel the weight of the pact pressing down on her family, a silent, inexorable force that demanded recognition. And in that moment, she understood that the Blackwell legacy was more than wealth or prestige. It was a burden, a chain forged by shadows, and Thomas's illness was only the first reminder that the pact's curse would not be ignored. By nightfall, Elizabeth could hear the faint rustle of the black-cloaked guardian moving through the grounds, its presence a silent affirmation that the family's past and future were inexorably entwined. The first bloodline curse had been awakened, and Ashbourne Manor seemed to breathe around her, whispering a promise that it would not be the last. The manor's library had become Elizabeth's refuge, the one place where she could attempt to untangle the ever-tightening web of shadows that clung to Ashbourne Manor. Thomas's illness had left a residue of unease in every room, and even the servants moved with a nervous hesitation that spoke volumes. Elizabeth could feel the weight of the house pressing on her shoulders, urging her to dig deeper into the family's dark past. It was during one of these quiet, restless evenings that she found herself drawn to the massive, leather-bound Blackwell family Bible, which rested on a lectern near the stained-glass windows. The Bible itself was unremarkable at first glance, its pages yellowed with age, its edges frayed, and its spine cracked from centuries of use. Yet something about it called to her, a low, insistent pull she could not ignore. She traced her fingers along the worn cover, feeling the faint indentation of what seemed like a hidden clasp. With a trembling hand, she pressed at the spot, and with a quiet click, a hidden compartment revealed itself beneath the cover. Elizabeth's breath caught in her throat as she pulled open the small cavity, revealing a collection of papers, sketches, and faded photographs that had been tucked away for generations. The first thing she noticed were the sigils, strange geometric shapes intertwined with flowing lines that seemed to shift subtly in the flickering candlelight. They were drawn with meticulous precision, inked in black that had resisted time itself. Elizabeth studied them for minutes, her mind straining to comprehend their meaning. Some appeared protective, almost like wards, while others carried a darker energy, like warnings etched into the very fabric of the paper. Beneath the sigils lay a series of cryptic warnings, written in a script that danced between English and an archaic language Elizabeth did not recognize. Phrases leapt out at her. "Neglect not the covenant. The blood remembers. Those who falter shall reap the shadow's harvest." Each line sent a chill crawling down her spine. It was as though the Bible itself whispered to her, a voice carried on the brittle pages that demanded attention, respect, and fear. Among the papers were portraits, their surfaces slightly warped with age. Elizabeth's eyes widened as she examined the faces of her ancestors. Men and women in fine colonial attire, each with hollow, haunting eyes that seemed to follow her every move. Some were depicted in poses of solemn reverence, others with expressions of terror, as if the weight of the pact had been visible upon their souls. The uncanny similarity in their gaze unnerved her, as though she were staring into the eyes of a family cursed to bear a shadow none could escape. Elizabeth's heart pounded as she realized that the Bible was more than a record of faith, it was a ledger of obligation. Each sigil, each warning, each portrait represented a link in a chain stretching back through centuries, connecting the Blackwells to the unseen force that had granted them their fortune and haunted their bloodline. It became clear to her that the family's wealth, their social standing, even their survival depended on knowledge that had been deliberately hidden, buried beneath layers of ritual and secrecy. As she replaced the contents and closed the hidden compartment, Elizabeth felt a strange sense of foreboding settle over her. The shadows in the room seemed deeper, the candlelight flickering with a life of its own. She knew that uncovering the Bible's secrets was only the beginning. The manor was alive with history, but also with expectation. The pact that had shaped her family demanded vigilance, and with each revelation, Elizabeth understood more fully the peril that hung over Ashbourne Manor. Somewhere within these pages lay the knowledge to protect her family or doom it entirely. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, carrying a hollow moan that seemed almost like a sigh from the house itself, as though Ashbourne Manor approved of Elizabeth's discovery or perhaps merely acknowledged that the next step in the curse's unfolding had begun. The storm came without warning, a furious tempest that rattled Ashbourne Manor to its very foundations. Rain lashed against the tall windows, and wind howled through the gaps in the ancient stonework like the cries of lost souls. Elizabeth stood near the hearth, where the fire flickered weakly against the shadows of the room, her fingers wrapped around the Blackwell Bible she had discovered only days before. The house felt restless, almost alive, as if it were holding its breath in anticipation. It began as a murmur, faint at first, barely distinguishable over the storm's roar. Elizabeth froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound was unmistakably human, though it seemed to echo from the walls themselves. Voices, old and weary, spoke in tones that shifted between sorrow, warning, and anger. They were whispers, fragments of conversations long past, and yet they were vivid enough to make her skin crawl. At first, she thought the storm had conjured her imagination, but as the minutes passed, the whispers grew clearer. They called her name, beckoning her closer to the library walls where the oldest shelves pressed against the manor's stone skeleton. Elizabeth approached cautiously, her hand brushing the cold, rough surface of the wall. It vibrated beneath her fingertips, not with wind or rain, but with something far older. The voices began to tell a story, one that belonged to her ancestors, etched in shadow and secrecy. They never knew the cost, one voice murmured, trembling as though weighted by centuries. Silas promised them riches, promised power, and they drank his lie. Elizabeth's breath caught as the story unfolded. The voices spoke of Silas Blackwell, the founder of their American line, and the night he had forged a pact with a shadowy, nameless figure. It was said he had betrayed his own kin, sacrificing the loyalty and innocence of those closest to him to secure wealth and influence beyond imagination. The walls seemed to vibrate with the echoes of his choice, and Elizabeth could almost feel the tremors of guilt and ambition that had seeped into the very stone of Ashbourne Manor. They were his blood, and he gave them to the shadow, another voice whispered, sharp and sorrowful. The covenant demands obedience. Their suffering became ours. The room seemed to pulse with the energy of the tale, the air thickening with an oppressive weight that pressed against Elizabeth's chest. She could see faint shapes in the flickering firelight shadows that mirrored the movements of the figures in the portraits from the hidden Bible compartment. The ancestor's eyes, hollow and accusing, seemed to speak directly to her, recounting centuries of fear, power, and betrayal. Each whisper detailed the moment the pact was sealed, the ceremony hidden in secrecy, the cries of the forsaken, and the cold, calculating hand of Silas as he accepted the shadow's bargain. Elizabeth shivered as a sudden clarity struck her. The voices were not merely memories. They were warnings. The curse was not dormant. The suffering of her brother, the ominous presence of the cloaked guardian, the restless manor itself, all were consequences of a decision made centuries ago, one that demanded vigilance and blood in return for the power the family enjoyed. The whispers implored her to understand, to remember, and to act before the pact demanded more than mere obedience. As the storm raged outside, Elizabeth pressed her forehead to the cold wall, listening intently. The voices faded gradually with the passing of the tempest, leaving behind an eerie silence. Yet their message lingered in her mind, etched deep into her consciousness. Silas Blackwell had chosen power over kin, and now, generations later, the Blackwell bloodline was chained to a legacy of shadow and obligation. Elizabeth realized, with a chill that pierced her very soul, that the whispers were only the beginning, and the true weight of the pact was far from fully revealed. Elizabeth's curiosity had become a constant companion, an unrelenting pull toward the mysteries that clung to Ashbourne Manor like cobwebs in the corners. On a quiet afternoon, while wandering the lesser-used eastern corridor, she noticed something odd, a faint draft slipping through a narrow seam in the wall. The panel looked ordinary, blending seamlessly with the dark wood, yet the chill it emitted seemed unnatural, almost deliberate. Her heart quickened as she pressed her fingers against it, and with a soft click, the panel swung inward to reveal a narrow staircase spiraling downward into darkness. A wave of apprehension surged through her, but the whispers from the storm a night ago urged her forward. She grabbed a lantern from the hallway, its flame flickering in hesitant protest, and descended the hidden stairs. The air grew cooler and heavier with every step, thick with the scent of dust, decay, and something far older, something almost metallic. At the bottom, she found herself in a long corridor lined with doors of blackened oak. Each door bore the faint etchings of sigils she recognized from the family Bible, twisted symbols that seemed to shimmer and shift in the lantern's light. Elizabeth approached the first door and found it unlocked. Beyond it lay a room filled with artifacts, relics that spoke of centuries of secrets and sacrifices. Strange objects of polished obsidian, carved bone, and tarnished silver glimmered dimly under the lantern's glow. Small jars lined the shelves, each containing unidentifiable powders and preserved items, some almost alive with movement beneath the glass. At the center of the room was a pedestal, atop which rested a leather-bound journal. She opened it, the pages crackling under her touch. The handwriting was old, meticulous, yet frantic, as if the writer had known the danger of every word. The journal belonged to one of her ancestors, and it chronicled the ongoing obligations of the Blackwell family, the rituals, the sacrifices, the consequences of neglecting the pact. Elizabeth's eyes widened at the details, each entry more disturbing than the last. One page described a ceremony that took place within a sealed room at the far end of the corridor, a chamber that pulsed with a darkness so dense it seemed to bend the light around it. "Do not enter," the note warned. "Those who trespass awaken what waits." Her curiosity overpowered fear. She followed the corridor to the sealed room. Its door was carved from a single piece of black wood, etched with intricate sigils that seemed to writhe under her gaze. The air here was different, thick and electric, like the moment before a storm strikes. Even from a few feet away, she could feel the energy thrumming against her chest, dark and insistent. She pressed her hand to the door, and a shiver raced down her spine, as if the manor itself were testing her resolve. Elizabeth knew instinctively that whatever lay beyond this door was connected to the very essence of the Blackwell curse. The shadows seemed to stretch and twist toward her, whispering in tongues she almost understood. Each heartbeat echoed in the silence, a drumbeat of forewarning. And yet, she could not step away. The hidden wing, with its journals, relics, and forbidden chamber, was a nexus of the family's power and its peril. To uncover its secrets was to confront the full weight of the pact that had bound the Blackwell bloodline for centuries, a darkness that was patient, waiting for her to falter. She stood there, hand on the door, listening to the pulse within, knowing that crossing this threshold would change everything. The manor's secret wing had revealed itself, and with it the undeniable truth. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed. Elizabeth had spent the morning wandering the sunlit halls of Ashbourne Manor, hoping the exposure to light might temper the ever-present chill that clung to the estate. Yet even daylight seemed unable to fully dispel the shadows lurking in corners or the sense of unseen eyes tracking her movements. Seeking solace in familiarity, she descended to the servants' quarters, a section of the manor she had seldom ventured into. It was quieter here, removed from the grandiosity of the family's main chambers, and the air carried a faint aroma of polished wood and old linens. She found Mrs. Calloway, a longtime servant whose tenure at the manor spanned decades, seated by a small wooden table, darning a pair of gloves. Her hands were steady, yet her eyes bore a weight Elizabeth could feel from across the room. Summoning courage, Elizabeth approached and asked about the rumors she had overheard, whispers of children who had disappeared, families cursed, and shadows that moved of their own accord. Mrs. Calloway's gaze flickered toward the window, as if she sought an escape from the daylight outside. Her voice was soft but firm, edged with a tremor that betrayed years of fear carefully concealed. "Miss Elizabeth, there are things in this house that should never be spoken of lightly," she began. "Generations of Blackwells have learned the hard way that the world beyond what we see is insistent. It demands respect, obedience, or it takes what it will." Elizabeth leaned closer, compelled by the mixture of dread and fascination. "What happened to the children?" she asked. "Were they harmed?" Mrs. Calloway's hands trembled slightly as she set the gloves aside. "Harmed? Perhaps. But more than that. They vanished. One day, they were here, laughing and playing in the gardens, and the next, nothing. No trace, no whispers of their whereabouts, just an absence that even the family's wealth and influence could not explain." The elders spoke in hushed tones, calling it the Blackwell debt, the consequence of ignoring what was promised long ago. Elizabeth shivered at the mention of the word debt, feeling the invisible weight of it pressing against her chest. "But the family? They knew?" she whispered, almost afraid to hear the answer. "Yes," Mrs. Calloway replied, her voice barely audible. "They knew. They always knew. The pact was made when your ancestor, Silas Blackwell, sought wealth and power without regard for the cost. The shadows we speak of, they watch, they wait, and when the family falters, they take. Children, servants, sometimes even the unwary stranger who crosses the threshold. The manor protects the Blackwell line, yes, but it does not forgive, it reminds." Elizabeth's mind raced. Every odd occurrence she had witnessed, the illness of her brother, the whispers in the walls, the hidden chambers, now converged into a pattern she could not deny. The pact was alive, a living contract etched into the very foundation of Ashbourne Manor, and its enforcers were patient and relentless. Mrs. Calloway leaned closer, her eyes locking onto Elizabeth's wealth. "Do not make the mistake that many have before you. Obedience is the only safeguard. And curiosity. Curiosity is a dangerous thing in this house. The shadows do not forgive mistakes, Elizabeth. They collect what is owed. The weight of her words settled like a stone in Elizabeth's stomach. She nodded slowly, absorbing the gravity of the warning. The manor was no longer just an ancestral home. It was a sentient entity, a keeper of secrets, and a silent executor of debts long contracted. Every hallway, every portrait with hollow eyes, every creaking floorboard now held a new meaning. Elizabeth realized that to navigate Ashbourne Manor safely, she would need more than courage. She would need wisdom, restraint, and an unflinching respect for the darkness that claimed its due without hesitation. As Elizabeth left the servants' quarters, the shadows seemed to follow her, lingering just beyond the edges of vision. She understood now that the Blackwell Pact was not a story from the past. It was an active, breathing force, and it had already begun marking her place in its long, unbroken ledger. Elizabeth had spent the better part of the afternoon exploring the hidden wing of Ashbourne Manor, drawn deeper into its labyrinthine corridors by a combination of fear and insatiable curiosity. Every turn of the cold stone hallways seemed to whisper secrets meant only for those brave or foolish enough to listen. The air grew heavier as she progressed, carrying a faint metallic tang that set her nerves on edge. It was here, behind a false panel she had only discovered by accident, that Elizabeth found the first evidence of the ritual her ancestors had performed, a secret that had shaped the Blackwell fortune for generations. The hidden chamber was small, circular, and oppressive. Symbols, etched deep into the stone floor, formed a concentric pattern that pulsed as though the manor itself were aware of her presence. Ancient sigils covered the walls, smeared with what appeared to be a dark, dried substance that hinted at blood. The patterns were intricate, almost hypnotic, and Elizabeth felt her stomach tighten as she traced them with her eyes. She could not help but shiver at the thought of what those symbols had once represented: a binding of prosperity to the very essence of the Blackwell bloodline, a pact that demanded obedience, loyalty, and sacrifice. A journal lay in the corner, its leather cracked with age. Elizabeth opened it with trembling hands, revealing pages filled with elaborate descriptions of ceremonies conducted centuries ago. The handwriting was spidery, uneven, and occasionally spattered with the same dark substance she had seen on the walls. The entries described a ritual performed under a new moon, where offerings, sometimes of animals, sometimes of those too young or too naive to resist, were presented at the center of the sigils. The text suggested that the ceremony was not merely symbolic, but a conduit, an invocation meant to bind the family's fortune and influence directly to the pact made by Silas Blackwell, the manor's founder. Elizabeth's heart raced as she read further. One entry, older than the rest and written in a shaky, almost frantic hand, warned of dire consequences for any Blackwell who failed to uphold the ritual. The author spoke of shadows that would rise to collect the debt owed, of children and servants who vanished without trace, and of a cloaked figure who enforced the covenant with tireless vigilance. The words resonated with the strange occurrences she had already witnessed: the illness of her brother, the whispers in the walls, the feeling that the manor itself watched her every step. The chamber seemed to close in around her as she examined the floor, realizing the etchings formed a map that led beyond the walls of the manor into the surrounding estate grounds. She understood then that the ritual had not been confined to a single night or a single act. It was a recurring cycle, a covenant renewed generation after generation, binding the family's prosperity to a darkness that demanded eternal vigilance. Elizabeth's fingers brushed over one symbol, and she felt a shiver crawl up her spine, a sensation that was both physical and unnervingly psychological. It was as if the manor itself were reacting to her touch, acknowledging her intrusion, warning her of the danger she now courted. The journal fell closed in her hands as she took a step back, the weight of her discovery pressing down like a physical force. The Blackwell Legacy was not merely a matter of wealth or lineage. It was a contract written in blood and fear, one that required continued compliance, or the shadowed consequences would strike again. As Elizabeth exited the hidden chamber, the wind outside picked up, rattling the manor's windows as if echoing the warnings within. She felt the manor watching her, the shadows observing her every movement, and she knew with chilling certainty that her discovery had irrevocably altered her place within the Blackwell family. The Pact was no longer just a story of the past, it was alive, and it had already taken notice of her. The first sign came on a gray morning that carried an unnatural chill, even for Virginia's early spring. Elizabeth noticed it before anyone else. The Blackwell estate's animals had become restless, pacing nervously in their enclosures, their eyes wide and unseeing, as if they glimpsed shadows invisible to human eyes. By noon, the first body was discovered, a prized mare, sleek and proud the day before, now collapsed in the muck of the paddock, lifeless, its hooves still trembling. Elizabeth's stomach turned, and she felt a shiver ripple down her spine. It was a quiet, ominous warning, subtle at first, like the warning murmurs of the manor she had grown to fear. The following days only deepened the unease. Crops in the fields failed inexplicably, shriveling into the soil as if the earth itself had turned against the estate. Tomatoes blackened on their vines, wheat stunted and yellowed, and the orchards bore fruit that was bitter and hollow. The family's groundskeeper, a grizzled man who had served generations of Blackwells, muttered to himself about curses, shaking his head and refusing to tend the fields. Elizabeth watched him from a distance, noting how the shadows seemed to cling to his hunched figure, whispering warnings she could not hear. Then the disappearances began. One by one, servants failed to return from their duties. At first, it was small things, a cook who vanished mid-shift, a stable hand who never came back from checking the horses. The household tried to rationalize it as travel, illness, or accident, but even they could not deny the pattern. Whispers spread through the staff quarters. The Pact had remembered them, and the manor's dark guardian had begun to enforce its claim. Elizabeth, already well aware of the history of the Blackwell curse, felt a tightening knot in her chest. Each vanishing was a reminder that Silas Blackwell's bargain was alive, patient, and merciless. Late one evening, Elizabeth walked through the estate grounds, compelled by a mix of dread and curiosity. The moon was a thin, pale sliver in the sky, and the mist clung low to the ground, curling around the gnarled trees like skeletal fingers. She saw it then, a faint, dark silhouette, standing at the edge of the orchard, unmoving yet impossibly present. It was the first time she glimpsed the cloaked guardian beyond mere rumor, a figure who seemed to absorb the light around it, radiating a quiet menace. Elizabeth froze, unable to look away, and the figure did not move. But she felt its gaze pierce through her, heavy and accusing, as if assessing her worthiness or her complicity. By the following morning, the weight of these events had settled over Ashbourne Manor like a suffocating fog. The family gathered in the drawing room, attempting normalcy, yet their conversations were hollow, their eyes darting toward dark corners as if expecting them to come alive. Elizabeth observed her parents, their usual composure fraying beneath the weight of dread they could not name. Even her younger brother, who had recovered from his earlier mysterious illness, now trembled at the slightest noise, glancing fearfully toward the shadows that seemed to stretch longer each day. Elizabeth understood with unshakable clarity that the Pact was no longer a distant memory or a warning in dusty letters. It was present, active, and insidious. The first signs of the Blackwell curse were not loud or violent. They were subtle, creeping, like the slow poison of fear and despair. And yet, Elizabeth knew that if these omens were only the beginning, the true depth of the Pact's power was yet to reveal itself. Every wilted crop, every vanished servant, every restless animal was a testament. The Blackwell bloodline had been chosen, marked, and it could never escape the shadows it had inherited. The estate had grown quiet, almost expectant, as if the very air waited for the next act. Elizabeth's pulse quickened. The first sign had come, and with it, the undeniable truth that nothing in Ashbourne Manor nor in the Blackwell Legacy would ever be the same again. The vision came unbidden, sweeping over Elizabeth like a storm that had been gathering for centuries. She had been walking through the hidden wing of Ashbourne Manor, the candlelight flickering against the stone walls, when the air shifted thicker, heavier, charged with something ancient and restless. It pressed against her chest, constricting her breath, and then the shadows seemed to stretch and writhe until they coalesced into forms she could no longer deny. Her eyes widened as she was drawn forward, not by her feet but by some invisible force tethered to the manor's cursed history. Suddenly, she was no longer in the manor she knew. The stone walls and polished floors dissolved, replaced by an otherworldly darkness that hummed with a terrible resonance. Before her stood Silas Blackwell, the founder of her bloodline, a figure whose face carried the weight of ambition and hubris. He knelt on the cold, damp ground, his hands trembling as he extended them toward a shadow that writhed and loomed, its form impossible to define. It was taller than any man, its shape obscured by a darkness that seemed to devour the very light around it. Elizabeth could feel the entity's power radiate outward, a cold, suffocating presence that whispered promises and threats all at once. Silas's voice broke the oppressive silence, reverent yet desperate. He swore loyalty, wealth, and protection, his words sealing a bond with the entity. Elizabeth's heart pounded as she watched him articulate the terms, with a precision that made her blood run cold. The souls of his descendants, bound for generations, would serve as both collateral and sustenance for this shadow. In exchange, the Blackwell name would flourish, their wealth and influence guaranteed across the centuries. Every word seemed etched in smoke and fire, lingering in the air like a curse that could never be erased. The scene shifted, and Elizabeth saw the consequences of that ancient moment unfold in terrifying clarity. Families of the era whispered of misfortune and sudden deaths, of children lost and fortunes that rose too quickly, unnaturally. She saw a pattern, a web of suffering that stretched across centuries, each generation of Blackwells unknowingly paying tribute to a pact forged in secrecy and fear. The shadowy entity watched with eternal patience, its presence a reminder that it was neither bound by time nor by mortal concerns. It existed solely to ensure the terms were enforced. Elizabeth tried to cry out, to warn the figures she saw, but no sound escaped her lips. She realized with a sinking dread that she was not merely an observer. The vision did not confine itself to the past. It reached into her, probing her own bloodline. Every fear, every hesitation, every whispered warning from the manor coalesced into an understanding she could not deny. The pact was alive, and she was a part of it, irrevocably tied to its consequences. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the vision ended. The oppressive darkness lifted, and Elizabeth found herself back in the hidden wing, her hands gripping the edge of a wooden table for support. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her heart hammering as if trying to escape the cage of her chest. Shadows flickered along the walls of the manor, taunting her with the memory of what she had witnessed. The weight of the pact settled over her like a suffocating cloak, and Elizabeth knew, with chilling certainty, that understanding its origin was only the first step. The true struggle was only beginning. She sank to the floor, trembling, her mind racing with questions and fear. Silas Blackwell's shadowy bargain had cast a darkness that spanned centuries, and now she understood that the curse of the Blackwell bloodline was not a story whispered in fear. It was a living, breathing force, and it had set its sights on her. Elizabeth's hands shook as she clutched the letters she had found in her father's study. The ink faded and curling at the edges, yet the words burned with a clarity she could not ignore. She had tried to rationalize the visions, the whispers in the walls, the shadows that moved of their own accord, but there was no escaping the truth anymore. The Blackwell family's wealth, their grandeur, their position in Virginia society. It was all rooted in something dark, something sinister, and it was alive. The pact that had bound their bloodline for centuries was no mere story or superstition. It was a living, breathing curse, and now it had reached her. Determined, she sought out her parents in the grand drawing room. The afternoon light streamed through the tall windows, dust motes dancing lazily in the beams, masking the tension she felt coiling like a serpent in her chest. "Mother? Father," she began, her voice unsteady but firm. "I've discovered something about our family, about Ashbourne Manor, about us." Her father, Edmund Blackwell, looked up from the ledger he had been studying, his brow furrowed. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight of authority. "Some things are better left alone. You're letting your imagination run wild." But Elizabeth could not be silenced. "This isn't imagination," she insisted, her hands trembling as she laid the letters and the small, cryptic sketches on the table between them. "The Pact, Father. It's real. The visions, the shadows, the sickness, the disappearances. It all ties back to what Silas Blackwell did centuries ago. We're bound by it. It's why everything in this house feels alive." Her mother, Evelyn, pressed a hand to her chest and shook her head, the color draining from her face. "Elizabeth, don't speak like that. Such talk, it's dangerous. People will think you've lost your mind." Elizabeth's frustration mounted. She had expected shock, perhaps fear, perhaps even a measure of understanding, but not this dismissive, patronizing denial. "It's not madness. I've seen it. I've heard the whispers. I've felt the weight of it. How can you just ignore this? How can you pretend that the suffering, the accidents, the illnesses, they're coincidence?" Edmund's eyes hardened, the lines of pride and stubbornness etched deep into his face. "Elizabeth, the Blackwell name survives because we maintain control, not because we chase ghost stories and shadows. You speak of curses and pacts as though they hold sway over your life. That's nonsense, child. Focus on your studies, your social duties. Leave these tales of darkness to the servants and the town gossip." Her mother's voice softened, but it was no less firm. "Your father is right. You mustn't dwell on these things. The manor has always been grand, our family strong. We do not invite fear into our home." Elizabeth felt the cold, suffocating weight of isolation settle over her. Their denial was not ignorance, it was a shield, a refusal to confront a past so dark it could shatter the fragile veneer of respectability they clung to. She realized then that breaking the silence would not be easy. Convincing them would require more than words. It would require proof, undeniable, impossible to dismiss, and even then, the Blackwells' pride might prove a stronger force than the truth itself. Her fists clenched, knuckles whitening, as she turned away. Pride, denial, fear, they had all chosen comfort over clarity, safety over truth. But Elizabeth could no longer stand in silence. The curse was real, and if her family refused to face it, she would face it alone. And perhaps, only by confronting it herself, could she hope to unravel the shadow that had haunted the Blackwells for centuries. As she left the drawing room, the shadows along the walls seemed to lean closer, whispering their approval or their warning. Elizabeth felt the cold certainty of her path ahead. The family's refusal to acknowledge the darkness only strengthened it, and now it was up to her to confront the shadow before it consumed them all. Elizabeth awoke to a piercing scream that shattered the pre-dawn stillness of Ashbourne Manor. The sound ripped through the halls, echoing off the marble floors and high ceilings, and she knew instantly that something unspeakable had happened. Heart-hammering, she raced down the winding staircase, her candle flickering like a frightened heartbeat, casting grotesque shadows against the walls. The air smelled of iron and smoke, thick and choking, and she felt a chill that was far colder than the autumn morning outside. She arrived at the hearth in the great hall to find chaos. Flames licked the edges of the grand fireplace, though it had been carefully extinguished the night before. Smoke curled into the air like black serpents, and the scent of scorched wood mixed with something far fouler. Her younger brother, Thomas, lay sprawled on the marble floor, his small body unnaturally still, eyes wide and staring at nothing. Blood pooled around him, dark and glistening, spreading across the hearth as if the manor itself had drawn it from him. Elizabeth's voice caught in her throat. "Thomas!" she cried, dropping to her knees beside him. She shook him, desperate for a sign of life, but his body was unyielding, unnervingly cold. Panic clawed at her chest as she looked around, searching for any explanation. There were no signs of forced entry, no weapons, no indication that anyone had harmed him, only the fireplace, the hearth, and the shadows that seemed to writhe along the walls as though celebrating a victory Elizabeth could not comprehend. Her parents arrived moments later, drawn by the screams, faces pale and expressions twisted between terror and denial. Edmund's hand trembled as he approached Thomas, and Evelyn collapsed into a nearby chair, clutching at her face to stifle her sobs. Elizabeth's chest tightened as she realized that her worst fears were manifesting in the most violent, irreversible way. The manor, which had always seemed merely alive, was now undeniably sentient, an entity capable of exacting vengeance, consuming grief, and feeding on the family's blood. The servants arrived too, their faces ghostly in the dim light, eyes wide with unspoken dread. One of the older maids whispered, trembling, "It has claimed him. The manor, the Pact." Her words struck Elizabeth with a chilling clarity. The curse was not merely a tale of shadows or ill fortune. It was alive, and it demanded tribute. The Blackwell bloodline was its offering, and Thomas's death was only the beginning. Elizabeth knelt beside her brother, feeling the cold seep into her bones, and for the first time, the enormity of the family's history pressed upon her. Generations had been bound to this pact, each ancestor's pride and ambition feeding a darkness that now had taken flesh in her own home. Her father's rigid demeanor faltered as he finally admitted, in a whisper more to himself than to her, We were warned. All of it. The letters. The rituals. We ignored it. But words offered no comfort. The manor seemed to pulse in response to their grief, walls creaking, portraits shifting, shadows lengthening in grotesque mockery. Elizabeth realized that mourning here was perilous. The house drew power from their despair, transforming sorrow into fuel for its relentless hunger. Tears blurred her vision, but she did not cry. She could not. The Blackwell curse was no longer an abstract threat, it was a predator, and she could feel it circling, waiting for the next transgression. Elizabeth knew then that survival required more than understanding. It demanded action, courage, and a willingness to confront the very darkness her ancestors had embraced. As the sun began to rise, pale light creeping through the windows, Elizabeth stood over her brother's lifeless form. The manor loomed above her, ancient and omnipotent, its walls echoing with whispers of past sins and the promise of more blood yet to come. And in that moment, Elizabeth understood with absolute certainty. The Blackwell family was caught in a tide of malevolence that would not be stilled until the pact itself was faced and perhaps broken once and for all. The day the scholar arrived, a sudden fog had rolled over Ashbourne Manor, wrapping the estate in a ghostly embrace that seemed to signal the world beyond the manor's walls, that something extraordinary and perilous was unfolding. Elizabeth had spotted the carriage from the second-floor window, a solitary figure stepping down from its steps, draped in a long, dark coat, the edges dusted with mist. His presence was immediately commanding, as though he had stepped out of a different era, yet there was an undeniable weight of knowledge in his gaze, piercing and precise. The scholar introduced himself as Dr. Alaric Voss, a man whose reputation in the study of arcane practices preceded him. He had traveled across continents, he claimed, following rumors of a family whose wealth and legacy were tethered to forces both unseen and unholy. Elizabeth felt a shiver crawl along her spine as he entered the manor, his eyes scanning the walls, the portraits, the shadows, as though they were pages in a book only he could read. Dr. Voss wasted no time. Once seated in the study, surrounded by Elizabeth and her wary parents, he spoke with a voice both calm and chilling, revealing that he had knowledge of the Blackwell Pact's origins. "This is no ordinary curse," he said, eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight. "It is a covenant forged in blood and shadow, crafted to bind prosperity to loyalty and betrayal to suffering. Your ancestor Silas did not merely make a promise, he bartered the very essence of his descendants' souls. To unravel it, you must understand that the pact is a living contract. It watches, it remembers, and it punishes." Elizabeth leaned forward, heart pounding. "Can it be broken?" she asked, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "Doctor," Tasting for one, again appeared. Voss's eyes flickered toward her, a mixture of pity and stern caution shadowing his features. Possibly, he said slowly, but breaking such a bond demands sacrifice. A life willingly offered, a debt repaid in full. The pact thrives on obedience, and even the faintest hesitation can multiply the cost. There is no undoing it without consequence, no reversal without peril. Her parents exchanged anxious glances, the weight of past denials pressing upon them. Evelyn whispered, almost too softly for anyone but Elizabeth to hear. "We've already paid too high a price, Thomas." Her voice broke, and the air in the study seemed to pulse with the echoes of grief. Dr. Voss nodded solemnly, acknowledging the truth that hung between them. "Indeed," he murmured. "Every generation has contributed, knowingly or not. The manor is both sentinel and executioner. The only path forward is deliberate, measured, and guided by knowledge of the forces at play." He produced a small, weathered grimoire, bound in cracked leather and etched with symbols Elizabeth did not fully comprehend. "Inside are the rites that can either sever the bond or bend it," he explained, setting it gently on the desk. "Study carefully, for ignorance can doom not only yourselves but the generations yet unborn. The pact is not merely a question of ritual, it is a test of courage, conviction, and the willingness to confront shadows that have been festering for centuries." Elizabeth felt both a thrill and a weight settle over her. Finally, a possibility glimmered. Fragile, but undeniable. Here was a chance, however perilous, to wrest some control from the invisible hands that had long dictated the fate of the Blackwell bloodline. She glanced toward the window, where the fog still clung to the estate, and felt a strange kinship with the scholar, a guide through darkness whose presence was both a warning and a promise. As the first notes of evening crept into the manor, Dr. Voss stood and surveyed the room. "Tonight," he said, "you will sleep under the shadow of the pact. Tomorrow, we begin the work that your family has long avoided. But remember, the price for meddling with forces older than this house is never small. Courage alone may not suffice." Elizabeth's hands tightened around the edge of the grimoire. Fear and determination warred within her, but a new resolve took root. She had witnessed death, seen the manor consume blood and sorrow, and now, with this scholar's guidance, she glimpsed the slim hope of reclaiming her family's fate, even if it meant facing consequences that none of them could yet imagine. The night stretched long, heavy with unseen eyes, and Elizabeth knew the shadow over Ashbourne Manor was far from yielding. By the time the following week had passed, Ashbourne Manor had grown colder. Not in temperature, but in spirit. The walls seemed to pulse with a quiet judgment, as if the house itself fed on the unease that now saturated every room. Elizabeth watched her family unravel before her eyes, and a sinking dread took hold. The curse was no longer a shadow at the edges of their lives, it was the air they breathed, the pulse in their veins. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Her mother, Evelyn, would pause mid-sentence, eyes wide and unfocused, as if some unseen presence whispered secrets only she could hear. Thomas Blackwell, Elizabeth's father, became increasingly irritable, slamming doors and accusing the servants of negligence, though nothing had been disturbed. Even small accidents, broken china, tripped stairs, doors left ajar, were interpreted as deliberate acts of sabotage. Fear, like a slow poison, crept into the corners of their minds, mutating every glance and gesture into suspicion. Elizabeth herself was not immune. At night, she would awake to see fleeting figures just beyond the candlelight, hear hushed murmurs echoing through the halls. She caught glimpses of her siblings behaving oddly, whispering to shadows that did not belong to the room. Sometimes she thought she saw the cloaked guardian lurking near the staircase, silent and watchful, the same figure she had glimpsed months before, its presence a chilling reminder of the pact that bound her family's fate. The fractures grew deeper when her younger brother, Nathaniel, began to experience visions of his own. He would wake screaming in the middle of the night, insisting that unseen hands had touched him, that the shadows in the corners were alive and watching. Each morning he would emerge pale and trembling, his small frame shaking with dread, and Elizabeth would feel the helpless weight of their shared lineage pressing down upon her. Paranoia seeped into every conversation. Arguments ignited over trivial matters, a mislaid book, a spilled cup of tea, a misplaced key, yet the accusations were sharp, venomous, as though the curse itself twisted their words into weapons. Friends who visited the estate commented on the change. The once proud Blackwells now seemed haggard, wary, their eyes darting to corners and doorways where no threat existed. The servants, too, felt the shifting tides. They whispered of the manor's curse aloud, their voices low and fearful, claiming that the family had begun to invite the darkness in through their quarrels and fear. Elizabeth overheard them speaking of vanished relatives, of unheeded warnings and bloodlines punished for ignoring the pact. Every story, every fearful glance, deepened the sense that the house itself was alive, watching, and ready to enforce the ancient agreement. Elizabeth tried to keep her own composure, but even she could feel the threads of her family fraying. Meals became silent affairs, punctuated by furtive glances and half-formed accusations. Hallways that once seemed imposing now felt suffocating, the portraits of ancestors on the walls appearing to scowl with judgment. Sleep was broken, dreams invaded by whispers, and the line between reality and vision blurred until none of them could trust their own eyes. By the end of the week, Elizabeth realized that the Blackwell family was not merely threatened by the pact, they were becoming its instruments, their minds and hearts bending under its pressure. Distrust, paranoia, and fear had become as natural as breathing. Each member suspected the other of hidden sins, of secret betrayals, and the house seemed to feed on it, growing ever more restless, ever more alive. Elizabeth's resolve hardened as she watched her family spiral. If they were to survive the curse and perhaps reclaim their bloodline, she would need to confront it directly. But with the manor itself conspiring to unravel them, every step forward seemed to invite madness. The Blackwells were fracturing, and she could feel, deep in her bones, that the worst was yet to come. Elizabeth sat in the dim light of the hidden wing, her fingers tracing the worn leather cover of the journal she had discovered behind a false panel in the wall. The air smelled of dust and decay, thick with the weight of centuries, yet she felt an unexplainable urgency pulsing through her veins. She had long suspected that the key to understanding the Blackwell curse lay buried in the estate's forgotten corners, and now she held what seemed to be the missing piece, the diary of Silas Blackwell's wife, Margaret. The pages were brittle, yellowed with age, and the handwriting was an elegant, deliberate script, but Elizabeth read on, captivated. Margaret's words were a mix of fear, sorrow, and desperate determination. She wrote of the day Silas had returned from a clandestine meeting with the shadowy entity, how his ambition had been lured by promises of power, wealth, and influence. Elizabeth shivered as she read Margaret's description of her husband kneeling before the darkness, swearing his descendants into servitude. It was one thing to know of the pact from fragmented letters and whispered stories, but to read Margaret's account made it painfully real, human, intimate, and horrifying. Margaret's diary revealed attempts to counter the pact, subtle acts of defiance that ultimately failed. She had attempted rituals, prayers, and even confessions meant to cleanse the family's bloodline, but the darkness that Silas had invoked was patient and insidious. It did not strike openly, but waited, watching, adapting to any resistance. Elizabeth's heart pounded as she realized the curse was not merely a series of unfortunate events or family misfortune. It was a living force, thriving on secrecy, obedience, and fear. The more hidden the truth remained, the stronger it grew. The entries grew darker, revealing the consequences of defiance. Margaret recounted the disappearance of servants, the untimely deaths of relatives, and even her own growing sense of helplessness. She had tried to warn her daughters and their children, but silence was enforced by the manor itself, whispers in the walls, fleeting shadows, and visions that bent the mind toward compliance. Elizabeth understood, with a chill running down her spine, that the Blackwell estate was not just a house, it was a vessel, a prison, and a guardian of the curse, ensuring the family's obedience across generations. Margaret's words were not only a warning but also a guide, though cryptic and fragmented. She wrote of symbols, rituals, and the delicate balance required to challenge the pact without inviting immediate retribution. Elizabeth realized that knowledge alone was dangerous. The curse punished the curious who acted rashly. Her mind raced with possibilities, how to confront a force that was tied to blood, secrecy, and fear, yet invisible to the eye. Each note Margaret left was a thread, fragile and intricate, weaving a map of resistance that Elizabeth felt compelled to follow. As the storm outside raged, the manor groaning under the wind, Elizabeth closed the diary momentarily and looked around the hidden wing. The portraits of long-dead Blackwells seemed to watch her, their hollow eyes reflecting judgment, warning, and perhaps a flicker of hope. For the first time she understood that the curse was not invincible. Margaret's words had shown cracks, glimpses of defiance that had once been attempted, and perhaps could be attempted again. Elizabeth knew she could not act alone. The Blackwell family's survival depended on confronting the darkness that had haunted them for generations. Yet, the diary made it terrifyingly clear. The curse thrived on secrecy, obedience, and fear. And even the smallest misstep could bring unimaginable consequences. She tucked the journal close, her resolve hardening. The hidden knowledge of Margaret Blackwell was a torch in the suffocating shadows of Ashbourne Manor, and Elizabeth knew she would have to follow its guidance or risk the same fate that had claimed so many before her. The storm outside intensified, rattling windows and shutters, but Elizabeth's fear had transformed into purpose. The curse would not break easily, and the manor would not yield its secrets without a fight. But she had Margaret's words now, and in them lay the faint glimmer of hope, a chance, however slim, to undo centuries of darkness. Elizabeth crept through the manor's halls under the cloak of night, her candle flickering against the cold stone walls. The hidden wing had revealed so much, yet the truth of the pact remained incomplete until she faced the entity itself. Every instinct in her body screamed to flee, but she could not allow another generation to suffer under the shadow Silas had unleashed. She gripped the candle tighter, its small flame shaking as though it too feared what lay ahead. The hallways seemed to stretch unnaturally, twisting and darkening as she approached the center of the estate, where the entity had been sensed for centuries. Shadows pooled in corners like living things, and the air grew heavy, almost viscous, pressing against her chest with every step. A low hum filled the silence, vibrating through her bones, and she realized that the manor itself was alert to her purpose. Every portrait, every statue, every carved molding seemed to watch her passage, recording her defiance. Finally, she reached the room she had glimpsed in the manor's secret wing, the one that pulsed with an unnatural energy. The door appeared ordinary, yet as she neared, it shimmered like heat on asphalt, as if the air itself resisted her entry. With a trembling hand, Elizabeth pushed it open, revealing a vast, dim space where shadows moved independently of the light. There, in the center, hovered the entity. It had no distinct form, merely a coalescence of darkness, eyes like smoldering coals, and a presence that radiated both intelligence and malice. Elizabeth's voice trembled, yet she forced it to steady. "I know what you are. I know what my family owes. But we will not continue like this. I demand freedom for my family, for our bloodline." The entity's gaze fixed on her, and the air seemed to contract, pulling at her very soul. A voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere, a whisper that scratched at her mind, deep and sonorous. "Freedom is not given, child. It is paid for, with the coin of life, obedience, and sacrifice. Each generation has its debt, and the balance must be maintained." Elizabeth swallowed hard, her stomach churning, but she refused to look away. "What price? Tell me. If there is a way to survive, I will bear it. I will do whatever it takes." The darkness coiled, and the shadows thickened around her like serpents. "The price is blood. Each generation owes its own, willingly or not. Your family survives because it pays. Turn from the pact, and the debt must be claimed elsewhere. A life for a life, child. Until the scales are balanced. Her mind raced. The implications dawning on her. Every illness, every disappearance, every tragedy her family had suffered, it had been calculated, deliberate. A ledger of souls maintained by this formless arbiter. The entity's terms were cruel, unyielding, yet precise. Elizabeth felt both fear and defiance ignite within her. She realized that to free her family, she would have to navigate this cruel bargain, finding a way to balance the scales without allowing further devastation. "I understand," she said finally, her voice steady, though her heart hammered in her chest. "I will find the way. I will honor the debt, but not endlessly. I will end this." The entity seemed to shimmer, coiling into the shadows and receding, though its presence lingered, cold and omnipresent. "Then your journey begins. Know this, child, the pact bends to none, and every choice carries weight. Proceed with care, for the next step may demand more than you can bear." Elizabeth stepped back into the hallway, the candle still flickering in her hand. The shadows seemed less oppressive, yet the burden she carried now felt almost tangible. She had confronted the entity, learned its terms, and understood the price her family paid. The next steps would be perilous. Yet for the first time, Elizabeth felt a spark of determination. The curse could be challenged, but only if she walked its darkness with courage, cunning, and unflinching resolve. The air in Ashbourne Manor was thick with tension, each corridor and room seeming to hold its breath as if the very walls awaited the family's decision. Elizabeth moved silently from one chamber to the next, the weight of knowledge pressing on her chest with a force she could scarcely bear. She had seen the truth of the pact, confronted the shadowy entity, and glimpsed the consequences of defiance. Now, the choice that had been looming over generations rested squarely on her shoulders. In the drawing room, her parents sat across from one another, faces pale and drawn. Her father's hands shook as he toyed with a silver letter opener, a nervous habit that betrayed the pride he so desperately clung to. Her mother's eyes were wide with fear, darting to every shadow, every whisper of movement in the dark corners of the room. They had seen the signs, felt the curse's grip on the family, yet denial still clung stubbornly to them. Elizabeth knew words alone could not break through that wall. They needed more than warnings. They needed confrontation with reality. "I've spoken to it," Elizabeth said finally, her voice breaking the silence like a bell in the empty house. "The entity, it told me what the pact requires. It told me what we owe." Her father's knuckles whitened around the letter opener. "You don't understand, Elizabeth. The family, everything we've built, everything that keeps this estate alive, if we defy it, we risk everything. We could lose it all." "You mean we could continue to lose it all slowly?" Elizabeth countered, her voice steady despite the storm of emotion inside her. "We've already lost so much. People we love, children who vanished, illnesses that make no sense. This isn't prosperity, Father." A trap disguised as fortune. Her mother reached out, gripping Elizabeth's hand. "And what choice do we have? The entity, it is not merciful. If we refuse, it will take everything. Everyone." Elizabeth nodded, understanding the fear that gripped them. She had felt it herself, in the shadows, in the whispering walls, in the suffocating energy of the manor. She had seen what obedience had cost and what rebellion might demand. The choice was brutal in its clarity. Perpetuate the pact, sacrificing morality and freedom for wealth and protection. Or defy it, risking annihilation but reclaiming their souls. She walked to the window, gazing out at the moonlit grounds, the wind rattling the ancient panes. The shadowed figure that had haunted them lingered at the edge of the estate, a reminder of the stakes. Elizabeth's mind raced through the possibilities, weighing each outcome, searching for a path that might spare her family yet break the cycle. But there was none simple, none without cost. Finally, she turned back to her family. "I will bear the burden," she said, voice trembling but resolute. "If we continue the pact, I will be the one to navigate its demands. If we break it, I will stand between the entity and this house. The responsibility falls on me, and I will not allow our bloodline to continue in silence and fear." Her father's eyes softened, mingling fear with pride. Her mother's grip on her hand tightened, a silent acknowledgement of the courage required. Elizabeth felt the weight of generations settle firmly on her shoulders, yet she did not falter. For the first time, the choice, terrible, unavoidable, and immense, was hers to make, and she would face it with unwavering resolve. The manor seemed to exhale, as if acknowledging her declaration. Shadows flickered in corners, restless, but there was no immediate response from the entity. Elizabeth knew it was waiting, patient and eternal. The moment of decision had arrived. The Blackwells would either continue in obedience, shackled by their ancestors' sins, or break free, paying the ultimate price for freedom. And whatever path she chose, Elizabeth Blackwell understood that her life and the legacy of her family would never be the same. The morning light broke hesitantly over Ashbourne Manor, spilling pale gold across the weathered stone and towering oaks that had witnessed centuries of the Blackwell legacy. The estate, though still standing, bore the marks of a conflict no mortal eye could fully comprehend. Windows were cracked, ivy had crept unchecked over the facade, and the air seemed to hum with a lingering tension, a vibration that whispered of promises made and debts paid. Elizabeth stood at the edge of the grand terrace, her gaze sweeping across the grounds, feeling the weight of everything that had come before her. The choice had been made, irreversible in its magnitude. Elizabeth had confronted the shadowy entity in the hidden wing, offering herself as a guardian between her family and the Pact's relentless demands. The entity had recoiled, its form flickering like a candle in the wind, and then vanished, leaving behind a silence so profound it pressed against the ears and the soul alike. The family had survived, yes, but survival was no longer simple. They were marked. They bore the invisible scars of a debt unpaid, a debt transferred from one generation to the next, and every step forward would carry the weight of centuries. Her parents, now frail and subdued by the knowledge of what had been narrowly avoided, moved through the manor like ghosts themselves. Pride had been stripped away, leaving only humility and the shadow of fear as a constant companion. Elizabeth's younger brother, once stricken by illness and fear, now lay in a fragile, quiet recovery, but the memory of his suffering hung over him, shaping his every smile, every tentative step. Even the servants, those who had survived the family's darkest days, whispered among themselves about the manor's persistence, the Blackwells' endurance, and the price exacted for their defiance. Elizabeth walked through the halls one last time, tracing the paths where shadows had danced and whispers had crawled along the walls. Each portrait she passed the ancestors with hollow eyes. The founders who had bound themselves to darkness seemed to watch her with something like respect, or perhaps envy. She understood now that Ashbourne Manor was not merely a home. It was a living testament to choice and consequence, a vessel for the sins, ambitions, and sacrifices of those who had come before. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint echo of voices long gone, murmuring their cautionary tale to the world beyond. Travelers in Virginia would speak in hushed tones of the Blackwells, of Ashbourne Manor, and of a bloodline touched by shadows and survival alike. Children would shiver at the stories of vanished heirs and unseen guardians, and townsfolk would feel a chill when passing the estate's wrought-iron gates. The legacy of the Blackwells was now legend, a warning etched into memory and stone alike. Elizabeth paused at the edge of the terrace, hand resting on the cool marble balustrade, and felt a mixture of triumph and sorrow. She had carried her family through the nightmare of their own history, yet she knew the cost would never truly fade. The Pact, though no longer immediately oppressive, lingered as a memory, a caution that freedom was never granted without vigilance, and that power gained through compromise could never be fully unburdened. As she turned back toward the manor, its spires and towers looming against the morning sky, Elizabeth understood that her role was not finished. She would be the keeper of their history, the protector of their fragile peace, and the voice that ensured the lessons of Ashbourne endured. The Blackwell bloodline, scarred but unbroken, would continue, a testament to resilience, courage, and the heavy burden of choice. And so, as the manor settled into the quiet of a new day, the story of the Blackwells, their wealth, their curse, and their legacy, became a tale whispered through Virginia for generations to come.